I sat frozen in the small plastic chair of classroom 3B, my hands gripping the edge of the table as Claire Daniels, my son Ethan's third-grade teacher, closed the door with a soft click that seemed to echo through my chest. The parent-teacher conference had gone perfectly normal for the first 20 minutes, discussing Ethan's progress in math, his love for reading, his tendency to daydream during science. But then her expression shifted, and she asked the other parents waiting outside to give us a few more minutes. The way her voice dropped, the way she glanced at the closed door, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone, I knew whatever came next would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. What she showed me on that screen wasn't just evidence of my husband's betrayal. It was proof that my entire marriage had been built on lies, and the revelation would set off a chain of events that would expose secrets buried so deep, even Derek never saw the reckoning coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in our Maple Ridge home. I'd made Ethan his favorite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, while Derek rushed through his morning routine, barely acknowledging either of us as he grabbed his leather briefcase and headed out the door. He'd been distracted lately, working longer hours at Hayes and Hoffman Financial Advisors, the wealth management firm he'd built with his college roommate Greg. I'd attributed his distance to stress, to the demands of growing a business, to the normal ebb and flow of a marriage approaching its 10th anniversary. Looking back now, I can see how deliberately I'd ignored the signs because acknowledging them would have meant confronting a reality I wasn't ready to face. Ethan had been unusually quiet that morning, pushing his pancakes around his plate with less enthusiasm than usual. When I'd asked him what was wrong, he'd simply shrugged and said he had a stomachache. I'd felt his forehead, checked for fever, but he seemed fine physically. I made a mental note to mention it to Claire during our conference that afternoon, thinking perhaps he was struggling with something at school that he hadn't shared with me. Children often communicated their anxieties through physical symptoms, and as a mother, I'd learned to read between the lines of his silences. The drive to Riverside Elementary School that afternoon had been pleasant, the October sun casting golden light through the trees that lined Riverside's historic downtown. I'd always loved this town, the way it balanced small-town charm with just enough sophistication to keep life interesting. Derek and I had moved here 7 years ago when he decided to open his financial planning practice, leaving behind the hectic pace of Portland for something more family-oriented. It had seemed like the perfect decision at the time: good schools, safe neighborhoods, a community where people still knew their neighbors' names. I'd arrived at the school 15 minutes early, as was my habit. The hallways smelled of cleaning solution and that distinctive elementary school scent, a mixture of crayons, paste, and childhood possibility. Ethan's artwork lined the corridor outside classroom 3B, and I'd paused to admire his contribution to the fall mural, a carefully drawn oak tree with leaves in shades of red and gold that showed real artistic promise. Pride had swelled in my chest as I traced the letters of his name in the corner. Whatever challenges we might face, Ethan was thriving, and that was what mattered most. Claire Daniels had welcomed me with her usual warm smile, gesturing to the child-sized furniture that always made parent-teacher conferences feel slightly absurd. She was younger than me by perhaps 5 years, with an earnest energy that made her popular with both students and parents. In the 2 months since school had started, I'd been impressed by her dedication, the way she truly seemed to see each child as an individual rather than just another name on her roster. Ethan adored her, often coming home with stories about Miss Daniels' creative lessons and patient explanations. The first part of our conference had been reassuring. Ethan was performing well academically, reading above grade level and showing particular strength in creative writing. His math skills were solid, though Claire noted he sometimes rushed through problems without checking his work, a trait he'd inherited from me, I'd admitted with a laugh. Socially, he had a small group of close friends and seemed well-adjusted, though Claire mentioned he'd been more withdrawn lately, less eager to participate in class discussions. That was when the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Claire had hesitated, her professional demeanor cracking slightly as she seemed to wrestle with a decision. She'd glanced at the door, then back at me, and I'd felt the first flutter of unease in my stomach. When she'd asked if we could have a few more minutes alone, I'd agreed without understanding why my palms had suddenly begun to sweat. What she told me next had required her to speak in a voice barely above a whisper, as though saying the words any louder might make them more real, more devastating. 3 weeks ago, during a school field trip to the Riverside Science Museum, Claire had been organizing the students into groups when she'd noticed a man and woman in what appeared to be an intimate conversation near the planetarium entrance. The woman had been laughing, her hand resting on the man's chest in a gesture that went beyond friendly. Claire hadn't thought much of it at first. People had private lives, and public displays of affection weren't her concern. But then the man had turned, and Claire had recognized him immediately. Derek Hayes, Ethan's father, her student's dad, the man who'd shaken her hand at the beginning of the school year and praised her teaching methods. The woman with him was decidedly not me. Claire had quickly ushered her students in the opposite direction, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd witnessed. She'd spent days agonizing over whether to say anything, weighing her responsibility to her student against the knowledge that inserting herself into a family's private business could backfire in countless ways. What had ultimately pushed her to speak up was Ethan himself. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd watched him withdraw further into himself. His creative writing assignments, once full of adventure and humor, had taken a darker turn, stories about families breaking apart, children feeling invisible, homes that didn't feel safe anymore. During lunch, he'd started sitting alone, pushing food around his tray without eating. When Claire had gently asked if everything was okay at home, Ethan had simply said that his dad was always gone and his mom seemed sad even when she was smiling. Children knew, Claire had explained, her eyes meeting mine with a compassion that made my throat tighten. They picked up on tensions and secrets even when adults thought they were hiding them successfully. Ethan was clearly struggling with something he didn't have the words to express, and Claire felt she couldn't stand by and watch him suffer without at least giving me the information that might help me understand what was happening in his world. Then she'd shown me her phone, and my world had tilted on its axis. The photo was slightly blurry, taken hastily from a distance, but the subjects were unmistakable. Derek, wearing the navy suit I'd helped him pick out last spring, standing close to a woman I'd never seen before. She was younger than me, probably in her late 20s, with sleek dark hair and the kind of polished appearance that spoke of expensive salons and personal trainers. But it was the way Derek was looking at her that had stolen the breath from my lungs, with an intensity and attention he hadn't directed at me in years. Claire had apologized profusely for the invasion of privacy, for the awkwardness of the situation, for potentially overstepping her bounds. But she'd felt compelled to share what she'd seen, especially given Ethan's recent behavior changes. She'd wanted me to have all the information so I could make the best decisions for myself and my son. Her voice had been kind but firm, the voice of someone who'd witnessed too many children caught in the crossfire of their parents' choices. I'd sat there in that tiny chair, staring at the photo on Claire's phone, feeling as though I were observing the scene from somewhere outside my body. This couldn't be real. Derek and I had our issues like any couple, but I'd never suspected infidelity. We'd built a life together, a home, a family, a shared history that spanned more than a decade. Yes, he'd been distant lately, but I'd rationalized it as work stress, as the normal evolution of a long-term relationship, as anything other than what the evidence now suggested. But even as denial rose in my throat, another part of my mind was clicking pieces together with terrible clarity. The late nights at the office that had become increasingly frequent. The new cologne he'd started wearing, claiming his old one had been discontinued. The way he'd become protective of his phone, taking it with him even when he went to the bathroom. The weekend business trips that had multiplied over the past 6 months. The credit card bills I'd stopped examining closely because I'd trusted him to manage our finances responsibly. Claire had continued talking, her words washing over me in waves I struggled to process. She'd mentioned that the woman in the photo worked at the Cedar Hill Country Club, where Derek had recently convinced me we should get a family membership. She'd overheard their conversation briefly before moving the students along, something about meeting later at their usual place. The easy familiarity between them had suggested this wasn't a new relationship but something that had been developing over time. I'd finally found my voice, thanking Claire for her courage in bringing this to my attention. My words had sounded strange even to my own ears, too formal and distant, as though I were reading from a script. Claire had offered resources, counseling services, support groups, the name of her own therapist who'd helped her through a difficult divorce. I'd nodded mechanically, gathering the information she'd written down on a piece of paper that I'd folded and tucked into my purse with hands that didn't feel like my own. Walking out of that classroom into the late afternoon sunshine had felt surreal. Other parents were clustered in small groups, chatting about upcoming school events and coordinating playdates. Children's laughter echoed from the playground where the after-school program was in full swing. Everything looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived 30 minutes earlier, yet everything had fundamentally changed. I'd climbed into my car and sat there for several minutes, staring at the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do next. The rational part of my brain knew I should confront Derek immediately, demand explanations, throw the evidence in his face and watch him scramble for justifications. But another part of me, the part that had been quietly observing and cataloging inconsistencies for months without consciously acknowledging them, knew that confrontation would only give him the opportunity to lie more effectively, to cover his tracks, to spin a story that would leave me doubting my own perceptions. Instead, I'd driven to the small coffee shop on Main Street where my best friend Nicole Romano worked as a manager. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nicole and I had known each other since college, had been bridesmaids at each other's weddings, had navigated the challenges of early motherhood together. If anyone could help me think clearly through the chaos swirling in my head, it was Nicole. I'd texted her from the parking lot, and she'd immediately stepped away from the counter, meeting me at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of concerned expression that made my carefully maintained composure crack at the edges. I'd told her everything. The conference, the photo, Claire's observations about Ethan's behavior, the mounting evidence I'd been unconsciously collecting over months. Nicole had listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I'd finished, she'd reached across the table and gripped my hand with a fierceness that anchored me to the moment. Then she'd said something that shifted my perspective entirely. Nicole had reminded me that I wasn't the naive young woman who'd married Derek a decade ago. I'd spent the past 8 years working as a freelance financial analyst, managing investment portfolios for a select group of clients who valued my discretion and expertise. I had my own income, my own professional reputation, my own financial resources. More importantly, I had skills that most betrayed spouses didn't possess: the ability to trace money, to uncover hidden accounts, to follow financial trails that people assumed were buried too deep to find. If Derek was having an affair, there would be evidence in the finances, and I was uniquely qualified to find it. The suggestion had sparked something in me, a cold clarity cutting through the emotional fog. Nicole was right. I didn't have to be a victim in this situation, didn't have to accept whatever version of events Derek chose to present. I could investigate, gather evidence, understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before making any decisions about my marriage or my future. Knowledge was power, and I had the tools to acquire knowledge that Derek never suspected I'd think to seek. We'd spent the next 2 hours strategizing. Nicole had a friend who worked as a private investigator, someone discreet who specialized in domestic cases. She'd make an introduction, arrange a meeting for the following day. In the meantime, I needed to act completely normal at home, give Derek no indication that anything had changed. The hardest part would be facing him across the dinner table, maintaining the facade of normalcy while my mind raced with questions and my heart ached with betrayal. I'd picked Ethan up from his after-school art club at 5, studying his face for the signs Claire had mentioned, the withdrawal, the sadness he was trying to hide. He'd climbed into the car quietly, clutching a painting of our family that made my throat tight. In the picture, the 3 of us stood in front of our house, but the figure representing Derek was noticeably smaller and farther away than Ethan and me. Children processed their world through art, and this painting spoke volumes about how Ethan was experiencing his father's emotional absence. Dinner that night had been a masterclass in pretense. Derek had arrived home at 7, later than he'd promised but earlier than he'd been managing lately. He'd kissed the top of my head absently, the gesture so routine it had probably required no thought at all. Over chicken stir-fry and rice, he'd asked about my day in the tone of someone who didn't expect or particularly care about the answer. I'd mentioned the parent-teacher conference, watching his face carefully for any reaction, but he'd simply nodded and complimented Claire's dedication before turning his attention to Ethan. Watching Derek interact with our son had been painful in new ways. He'd asked superficial questions about school, barely listening to the answers, his mind clearly elsewhere. Ethan had responded in monosyllables, picking at his food, and the distance between father and son had been palpable. After dinner, Derek had retreated to his home office, claiming he had client reports to review, while Ethan and I had curled up on the couch to read together. It was during these quiet moments with my son that my resolve hardened into something unbreakable. Whatever Derek had done or was doing, Ethan deserved better. He deserved a father who was present and engaged, or he deserved clarity about why his father couldn't be those things. He deserved a mother who was strong enough to face difficult truths and make hard decisions. He deserved honesty, even when honesty was painful. And I was going to make sure he got it. That night, after Ethan was tucked into bed and Derek had fallen asleep beside me, I'd lain awake staring at the ceiling, my mind mapping out the investigation ahead. I would examine our financial records with new eyes, looking for patterns I'd previously dismissed. I would track Derek's movements, document his schedule, note the discrepancies between what he claimed and what was real. I would meet with Nicole's private investigator friend and provide him with every piece of information that might help build a comprehensive picture of my husband's secret life. But more than that, I would prepare myself for whatever I discovered. Whether this was a brief affair that could be overcome with counseling and commitment, or something deeper and more destructive that would require ending our marriage, I would face it from a position of knowledge and strength. I would not be blindsided again. I would not allow Derek to control the narrative or manipulate my emotions. I would gather every piece of evidence, understand every dimension of his betrayal, and then I would make decisions based on facts rather than fear. The next morning, I dropped Ethan at school and driven directly to the office of Marcus Chen, the private investigator Nicole had recommended. His office was located in a professional building downtown, understated and discreet. Marcus himself had been in his mid-40s, with a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He'd listened to my story without judgment, taking notes on a legal pad, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his experience with cases like mine. Marcus had explained his process. Surveillance would begin immediately, tracking Derek's movements and documenting his interactions. He'd also recommended installing monitoring software on our shared computer at home, software that would recover deleted emails and browsing history. It felt invasive and wrong, but Marcus had pointed out that Derek had already violated the fundamental trust of our marriage. Discovering the truth wasn't a betrayal, it was a necessary step toward understanding the situation I was actually in rather than the one I believed myself to be in. I'd provided Marcus with Derek's schedule, photos, the make and model of his car, the location of his office, and everything else that might help the investigation. We discussed payment, and I'd arranged to cover his fees from my own business account, money that Derek had no access to or knowledge of. This investigation would be completely separate from our shared finances, ensuring that he'd have no way of discovering what I was doing until I was ready to reveal it. Over the following week, I transformed into someone I barely recognized. On the surface, everything appeared normal. I made breakfast, dropped Ethan at school, worked with my financial analysis clients, prepared dinners, smiled when expected. But underneath that carefully maintained facade, I was conducting an investigation that grew more complex and disturbing with each passing day. Marcus had begun sending me daily reports, complete with photographs and timestamps that documented Derek's movements. What I discovered wasn't just a simple affair. It was a systematic pattern of deception that had been unfolding for at least 8 months, possibly longer. The woman from Claire's photograph was named Vanessa Porter, and she worked as the events coordinator at Cedar Hill Country Club. According to Marcus's research, she was 29 years old, unmarried, and had been employed at the club for just over a year. The timeline was significant. Derek had suddenly insisted we needed a country club membership about 13 months ago, claiming it would be good for networking and would give Ethan access to tennis lessons and swimming. I'd questioned the expense at the time, but Derek had assured me it was a worthwhile investment in our family's social connections and his business development. Now I understood the real reason for that membership. Marcus's surveillance had documented Derek and Vanessa meeting at the club 3 times in the past week alone, always during hours when Derek had told me he was meeting clients or working late at the office. The photographs showed them having lunch on the terrace, walking through the gardens, sitting close together at the bar. Their body language spoke of intimacy and familiarity, the way Vanessa would lean into Derek when she laughed, how his hand would rest on the small of her back as they walked, the way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. But the surveillance was only part of what I was uncovering. My own investigation into our finances had revealed a trail of expenses that told a much more detailed story. Derek had opened a credit card I'd known nothing about, one that didn't appear on our joint accounts. Marcus had connections who could access certain records, and what we found on that hidden card made my stomach turn. Charges at expensive restaurants I'd never visited, hotel rooms booked during supposed business trips, jewelry purchases from stores I'd never heard of, weekend getaways to coastal resorts. The amounts weren't enormous. Derek had been careful not to spend so extravagantly that it would trigger alerts or raise obvious questions. But over 8 months, those charges added up to nearly $30,000. $30,000 of our money, earned through Derek's business and my freelance work, spent on another woman while I'd been clipping coupons and suggesting we postpone the bathroom renovation to save money. The financial betrayal somehow felt even more calculated than the emotional one, a deliberate siphoning of resources from our family to fund his double life. I'd also discovered something else in my financial deep dive, something that troubled me almost as much as the affair itself. Derek had been moving money from our joint investment accounts into a separate account I couldn't access. The transfers were small enough to escape notice, $2,000 here, $3,000 there, but they'd been happening regularly for the past 6 months. When I added them up, he'd moved over $40,000 into an account that appeared to be in his name only. The implications were chilling. Derek wasn't just having an affair, he was financially preparing for something, possibly planning to leave me or protecting assets in anticipation of divorce. My sister Rachel had come to visit that weekend, ostensibly for Ethan's birthday planning but really because Nicole had called her and explained what was happening. Rachel lived 3 hours away in Seattle, working as a family law attorney at one of the city's most prestigious firms. She'd arrived Friday evening, and after Ethan was in bed, the three of us, Rachel, Nicole, and I, had sat around my kitchen table while I laid out everything I'd discovered. Rachel's professional assessment had been delivered with the kind of clinical detachment that came from years of handling divorce cases, but I could see the anger simmering beneath her composed exterior. She'd asked detailed questions about the hidden credit card, the transferred funds, our shared assets, Derek's business structure, and my own financial contributions to the marriage. With each answer, her expression had grown more serious. When I'd finished, she'd set down her wine glass and looked at me with the same protective intensity she'd had when we were children and someone had dared to bully her younger sister. What Derek was doing, Rachel had explained, looked very much like someone planning to file for divorce on his own terms. The movement of assets, the hidden spending, the separate account, these were all red flags that suggested he was preparing to leave while positioning himself for the most favorable financial outcome possible. In many divorces, the spouse who planned ahead had a significant advantage, and Derek appeared to be following a playbook that Rachel had seen too many times in her practice. The fact that he was doing this while I remained oblivious to his affair made it even more calculated and cruel. Rachel had advised me to start my own preparations immediately. I needed to document everything, every asset, every account, every piece of property we owned together. I needed to secure copies of tax returns, bank statements, business records, anything that showed the true picture of our financial situation. I needed to open my own accounts that Derek couldn't access and begin setting aside money for legal fees and living expenses. Most importantly, I needed to consult with a divorce attorney immediately, even if I hadn't decided whether to actually file. Knowledge was protection, and I needed to understand my legal options before Derek forced my hand. The weekend had been devoted to this grim task. While Derek took Ethan to a soccer game on Saturday, giving me several hours alone in the house, I'd methodically photographed and copied every financial document I could find. Derek kept files in his home office, and I'd gone through them with systematic thoroughness, using my phone to create digital copies of everything that might be relevant. Tax returns going back 7 years. Business partnership agreements. Property deeds. Investment statements. Insurance policies. Our prenuptial agreement, which I'd barely glanced at when we'd signed it a decade ago but which now required careful examination. What I'd found in those documents had been illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. Hayes and Hoffman Financial Advisors was more profitable than I'd realized, generating substantial income that Derek had downplayed in our household discussions. His claims that money was tight, that we needed to be careful with spending, that certain purchases would have to wait. These had apparently been tactics to keep me from questioning his financial decisions while he quietly moved money and spent lavishly on his affair. The deception wasn't just about Vanessa, it was woven through every aspect of our financial life. I'd also discovered insurance policies I'd never known existed, including a substantial life insurance policy on me with Derek as the sole beneficiary. The policy had been taken out 3 years ago, and while life insurance for a married couple wasn't unusual, the fact that I'd never been told about it felt ominous in light of everything else I was learning. Rachel had made me promise to be careful, to vary my routines, to trust my instincts if anything felt wrong. The suggestion that I might need to worry about my physical safety had seemed melodramatic until Rachel had quietly mentioned several cases she'd handled where financial planning for divorce had escalated into something darker. Marcus had continued his surveillance throughout the weekend, and the reports he'd sent had painted an even clearer picture of Derek's double life. On Friday night, while supposedly attending a business dinner with potential clients, Derek had actually met Vanessa at an upscale Italian restaurant in the neighboring town of Westbrook. They'd lingered over dinner for 3 hours, and Marcus's photographs captured them holding hands across the table, Derek brushing a strand of hair from Vanessa's face, the two of them kissing in the parking lot before getting into separate cars. On Saturday afternoon, after returning Ethan from the soccer game, Derek had claimed he needed to go back to the office for a few hours. Marcus had followed him to a hotel 20 minutes outside Riverside, where Vanessa's car was already parked. Derek had entered the hotel at 2:45 in the afternoon and hadn't emerged until 6:30 that evening. The photographic evidence was damning and explicit enough that no amount of creative explanation could explain it away. This wasn't a friendship that had crossed boundaries or an emotional connection that hadn't become physical. This was a full affair, conducted with such regularity and comfort that it had clearly been going on for months. What struck me most forcefully as I reviewed Marcus's reports wasn't the affair itself, which had been confirmed beyond doubt within the first few days of surveillance. It was the casual ease with which Derek moved between his two worlds. He could spend 3 hours in a hotel room with Vanessa, then come home and tuck Ethan into bed, reading him a bedtime story with no apparent internal conflict or guilt. He could kiss another woman in a parking lot, then kiss me goodbye the next morning as he left for work. The compartmentalization required for such behavior suggested either a sociopathic lack of empathy or such deep self-justification that he'd convinced himself his actions were somehow acceptable. By Sunday evening, I'd made several decisions. First, I would not confront Derek until I had complete information and a clear plan for how to proceed. Rachel had been adamant about this. Premature confrontation would only give Derek the opportunity to hide assets, delete evidence, and construct a narrative that served his interests. I needed to maintain the element of surprise while continuing to gather documentation that would protect me legally and financially. Second, I would consult with the divorce attorney Rachel had recommended, a woman named Helen Bradshaw who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for aggressive advocacy on behalf of her clients. Rachel had already reached out to Helen on my behalf, and an appointment was scheduled for Tuesday morning. I would use that consultation to understand my options, the likely outcomes of different approaches, and what I needed to do to protect both myself and Ethan through whatever came next. Third, and perhaps most importantly, I needed to address Ethan's emotional well-being. Claire had been right that my son was struggling, and he deserved support even if he didn't fully understand what was happening. I'd scheduled an appointment with Dr. Patricia Kim, the school counselor, for Monday afternoon. Dr. Kim had extensive experience with children navigating family transitions, and I needed her guidance on how to help Ethan through this process in the least damaging way possible. Monday morning arrived with a gray drizzle that matched my mood. Derek had left early for a breakfast meeting, and I'd made Ethan his favorite cinnamon toast before driving him to school. As we'd sat together at the kitchen table, Ethan had looked at me with his father's dark eyes and asked a question that pierced through all my careful planning and strategic thinking. "Mom, are you and Dad getting a divorce?" His voice had been small and frightened, the voice of a child who'd been listening to arguments he wasn't supposed to hear, sensing tensions he wasn't supposed to notice, carrying worries he was too young to articulate clearly. I'd pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo, trying to figure out how to answer honestly without burdening him with adult problems he shouldn't have to carry. I'd told him that Mom and Dad were going through a difficult time, that sometimes adults had problems they needed to work through, but that no matter what happened, both of us loved him completely and that would never change. I'd promised him that we would talk more when I understood the situation better, but that he should know he was safe, he was loved, and nothing that was happening was his fault. Ethan had nodded against my shoulder, and I'd felt wetness seeping through my shirt where his tears were falling silently. 8 years old, I'd thought, and already learning that the adults he trusted could let him down, that families could fracture, that love wasn't always enough to hold things together. The unfairness of it had made me want to scream, but instead, I'd held my son and made silent promises about the kind of mother I would be through whatever came next. The appointment with Dr. Kim that afternoon had been both helpful and heartbreaking. The school counselor had met with Ethan first, engaging him in play therapy techniques that allowed him to express feelings he couldn't put into words. Through drawing and storytelling, Ethan had revealed that he thought his father was disappearing, that he worried his dad didn't love him anymore, that he was afraid of doing something wrong that would make his dad leave forever. The fact that Ethan was internalizing his father's absence as somehow his own fault had been devastating to hear. Dr. Kim had then met with me privately, offering both professional guidance and compassionate support. She'd emphasized that children were remarkably resilient when given honest information appropriate to their developmental level, consistent routines, and the assurance that they were loved. Whatever happened between Derek and me, Ethan needed to know that both parents remained committed to him, that the adult problems were not his responsibility to solve, and that his feelings, whatever they might be, were valid and acceptable. I'd asked Dr. Kim about the best way to tell Ethan about divorce if it came to that, and her answer had been both reassuring and sobering. Children often already knew when something was fundamentally wrong in their family, she'd explained. The formal announcement of divorce was often less shocking than parents anticipated because the child had been living with the reality of parental discord for weeks or months already. What mattered was how the information was delivered, calmly, with both parents present if possible, with clear reassurances about the child's future and security. Tuesday morning had brought my meeting with Helen Bradshaw, and stepping into her office had felt like crossing a threshold into a new version of my life. Helen's office was located in downtown Riverside's nicest professional building, her waiting room decorated with tasteful art and comfortable furniture that managed to be both professional and welcoming. When she'd emerged to greet me, I'd been struck by her presence, a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair, sharp eyes, and an air of competent authority that immediately inspired confidence. Helen had spent 2 hours reviewing every detail of my situation, taking copious notes, asking questions that demonstrated both her legal expertise and her understanding of the emotional complexity of divorce. She'd examined copies of our financial documents, studied the surveillance photographs Marcus had provided, reviewed our prenuptial agreement, and created a comprehensive picture of the legal landscape I was navigating. Her assessment had been delivered with the kind of straightforward honesty I was learning to appreciate. The prenuptial agreement Derek and I had signed was actually quite favorable to me, despite his having insisted upon it. It protected the business I'd been developing before our marriage, guaranteed me a substantial share of assets acquired during the marriage, and included provisions for spousal support that reflected my financial contributions to our household. Ironically, Derek's attempt to protect himself with a prenup had actually created a framework that would serve me well in divorce proceedings. The evidence of Derek's affair and financial deception strengthened my position considerably. Oregon was a no-fault divorce state, but proof of dissipation of marital assets, Derek's spending of joint money on his affair, could impact property division. The hidden credit card charges, the transferred funds, the hotel rooms and gifts purchased for Vanessa, all of this demonstrated that Derek had been using marital resources for his personal benefit, which courts took seriously when dividing property. Helen had outlined several possible approaches. We could file for divorce immediately, seeking temporary orders that would freeze assets and prevent Derek from moving more money. We could continue gathering information for a few more weeks, building an even stronger case. We could attempt mediation, though Helen had been skeptical that someone as calculating as Derek would negotiate in good faith. Or we could propose a separation agreement that would establish clear boundaries while giving both parties time to consider their options. I'd listened to all these possibilities, feeling the weight of decisions that would reshape not just my life but Ethan's future. Helen had been clear that whatever I chose, timing would be important. The longer I waited, the more opportunity Derek had to hide assets or prepare his own legal strategy. But rushing into filing without complete information could also leave me vulnerable. The balance between these competing concerns required careful consideration. What I needed to understand, Helen had emphasized, was that I had both power and options in this situation. Too many spouses discovered affairs and immediately felt victimized, allowing their betraying partner to control the narrative and outcome. But I had resources, my own income, my financial expertise, solid legal standing, and most importantly, information that Derek didn't know I possessed. The question wasn't whether I could successfully navigate a divorce, it was what approach would protect both my interests and Ethan's well-being most effectively. I'd left Helen's office with a retainer agreement to review, a list of additional documents to gather, and a timeline for making decisions about how to proceed. My phone had buzzed as I'd walked to my car, a text from Derek saying he'd be home late again, some crisis with a client that required his immediate attention. I'd stared at that text, knowing with absolute certainty that there was no client crisis, that he was probably meeting Vanessa, that every word he wrote to me was just another layer of deception in a marriage that had become built entirely on lies. That evening, I'd made the decision that would set everything else in motion. I'd called Marcus and asked him to expand his surveillance, to document not just Derek's affair but also any interaction he had with our shared finances. I wanted to know if he was moving more money, meeting with attorneys, taking any steps that suggested he was planning to file for divorce on his terms. I'd also asked Marcus to research Vanessa more thoroughly, her background, her finances, whether there were any red flags that might explain why a 29-year-old woman would pursue a relationship with a married man nearly 15 years her senior. I'd spent the evening reviewing my own client accounts, ensuring my business finances were completely separate from anything Derek could access or claim. My freelance financial analysis work had grown substantially over the past 3 years, and I'd been more successful than I'd fully acknowledged even to myself. If I needed to support myself and Ethan independently, I could do so comfortably. That realization had been empowering. I wasn't trapped by financial dependence, wasn't forced to stay in a broken marriage because leaving would mean poverty or struggle. Wednesday had brought new information from Marcus that shifted my understanding of the situation yet again. His background research on Vanessa had uncovered something interesting. She'd been engaged 2 years ago to a man who worked in finance, but the engagement had ended abruptly 6 months before their wedding. Marcus had tracked down the ex-fiancée, who'd been willing to talk once he understood the situation. According to him, Vanessa had a pattern of pursuing unavailable men, particularly those with money and status. She'd told him she wanted financial security above all else, that she'd grown up poor and was determined never to be in that position again. The ex-fiancé had ended their relationship when he discovered she was simultaneously dating 2 other men, both significantly wealthier than him. His description of Vanessa painted a picture of someone calculating and strategic in her romantic relationships, someone who viewed men primarily through the lens of what they could provide financially. This information didn't excuse Derek's choices, but it did provide context for how the affair might have developed. Derek, with his financial planning business and country club connections, would have seemed like exactly the kind of target Vanessa sought. Marcus had also uncovered something even more significant during his expanded surveillance. Derek had met with an attorney on Tuesday afternoon, the same day I'd been consulting with Helen Bradshaw. The attorney's name was Robert Fitzgerald, and a quick search revealed he specialized in family law and had a reputation for aggressive tactics in high-conflict divorces. The timing couldn't have been coincidental. Derek was preparing for divorce, likely planning to file first and catch me off guard, believing I was still oblivious to his affair and his financial maneuvering. This discovery had crystallized my thinking. I was no longer investigating to decide whether to end my marriage. Derek had already made that decision for both of us through his actions. Now I was simply ensuring that when the inevitable confrontation came, I would be fully prepared rather than blindsided. The race was on to see who would file first, and I had no intention of letting Derek control that narrative. I'd immediately called Helen and shared this new information. Her response had been swift and decisive. We needed to file within the week, before Derek had the opportunity to implement whatever strategy he and his attorney were developing. Helen would begin drafting the divorce petition immediately, along with temporary orders that would prevent Derek from accessing or moving joint funds, require him to maintain all existing insurance policies, and establish temporary custody arrangements for Ethan. We would request that Derek move out of the family home, arguing that stability for Ethan required him to remain in his familiar environment with his primary caregiver. The next few days had been a blur of legal preparation and emotional turbulence. I'd continued maintaining my facade of normalcy at home while spending every free moment gathering additional documentation and preparing for the upheaval ahead. Derek had remained oblivious, still caught up in his double life, still believing I was the unsuspecting wife he could manipulate and deceive indefinitely. Watching him play this role had become almost surreal. I could see clearly now how every gesture, every word, every apparent kindness was calculated theater designed to keep me compliant and unaware. Thursday evening had brought an unexpected development. Derek had come home earlier than usual, carrying flowers and a bottle of wine, suggesting we have a date night at home after Ethan went to bed. The gesture had been so transparently manipulative that I'd almost laughed. He was clearly feeling guilty or perhaps worried that I was becoming suspicious, and this was his attempt to reassure me, to perform the role of attentive husband just enough to keep me from asking uncomfortable questions. I'd played along, cooking dinner while Derek helped Ethan with homework, the three of us eating together at the kitchen table like a normal family. The conversation had been superficial and pleasant, Derek asking about my work projects, me inquiring about his day at the office, both of us lying smoothly to each other while our son watched with quiet, worried eyes. After Ethan had gone to bed, Derek and I had sat on the couch with our wine, and he'd made a speech about how much he loved me, how grateful he was for our family, how he knew he'd been distracted lately but was going to make more effort to be present. The speech had been polished and practiced, and I'd wondered if he'd rehearsed it with his attorney or perhaps with Vanessa herself. I'd responded appropriately, thanking him for the thoughtful gesture, agreeing that we'd both been busy and needed to prioritize our relationship more. Inside, I'd been cataloging every word, every false promise, adding them to the mountain of evidence that demonstrated just how thoroughly Derek had betrayed not just our marriage vows but the basic human decency of honest communication. Friday morning had arrived with a phone call from Marcus that changed everything yet again. His surveillance had captured Derek and Vanessa having an argument outside the country club, their voices raised enough that the directional microphone Marcus was using had picked up fragments of their conversation. Vanessa had apparently been pressuring Derek to leave me, to stop stringing her along with promises of a future together, to make a concrete commitment to their relationship. Derek had been trying to calm her down, explaining that he needed to time things carefully, that he couldn't just abandon his son, that the financial complications required careful planning. But the most significant part of their argument had come when Vanessa had threatened to tell me about the affair herself if Derek didn't file for divorce within the next month. She was tired of being the other woman, tired of secret meetings and hiding their relationship, tired of waiting for Derek to follow through on his promises. Derek had pleaded with her to be patient, had assured her he was already talking to lawyers, had promised that the divorce process would begin soon. Vanessa had finally agreed to wait, but her ultimatum was clear: 1 month, or she would force the issue by revealing everything herself. This information had accelerated my timeline dramatically. I couldn't risk Vanessa deciding to contact me directly, couldn't allow Derek to control when and how the truth came out. Helen and I had agreed that we would file the divorce petition on Monday morning, serving Derek at his office where his reaction would be witnessed by colleagues and business associates. It wasn't the kindest approach, but kindness was no longer a consideration when dealing with someone who'd systematically deceived me for months while planning to abandon our marriage on his own terms. The weekend had been devoted to final preparations and difficult conversations. I'd sat down with Ethan on Saturday morning while Derek was at the gym, and I'd told him as gently as I could that Mom and Dad were going to be living in separate houses for a while. I'd explained that sometimes adults had disagreements they couldn't solve while living together, but that both of us loved him completely and would always be his parents no matter where we lived. I'd promised him that he would still see both of us regularly, that his life would stay as normal as possible, that none of this was his fault or his responsibility. Ethan had cried, and I'd held him, my own tears falling into his hair as I tried to provide comfort while my own world was crumbling. He'd asked the questions children always asked in these situations: why couldn't we just work things out? Couldn't we try harder? Didn't we love each other anymore? I'd answered as honestly as I could without burdening him with adult betrayals and deceptions. Sometimes love wasn't enough when people made choices that broke trust, I'd told him. Sometimes the healthiest thing for everyone was to acknowledge that a relationship wasn't working and make changes, even when those changes were painful. Dr. Kim had advised me to tell Ethan before serving Derek with divorce papers, to give him time to process the information with my support before everything became chaotic and public. It had been the right call, even though it had been one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had. Ethan deserved to hear about his parents' separation from me, in a calm environment, with the opportunity to ask questions and express his feelings, rather than being blindsided by sudden upheaval. Sunday had been my last day of pretending, and I'd spent it in a strange emotional state, grief for the marriage that was ending mixed with relief that the deception would soon be over, fear about the challenges ahead balanced by determination to face them with strength and integrity. Derek had been home most of the day, seemingly making an extra effort to be present after his date night gesture earlier in the week. He'd played soccer with Ethan in the backyard, helped with meal preparation, even suggested we watch a family movie together in the evening. Sitting on the couch that night, Ethan between Derek and me, watching an animated film about a family of adventurers, I'd felt the surrealness of the moment wash over me. This was the last evening we would spend as an intact family, the last few hours before everything changed irrevocably. Derek had no idea that divorce papers were already prepared, that a process server was scheduled to deliver them to his office the next morning, that by this time tomorrow our marriage would be officially over in everything but legal finality. I'd looked at him during a quiet moment in the movie, studying his profile in the flickering light from the television. This man I'd loved, married, built a life with, who was he really? Had I ever truly known him, or had I been in love with a carefully constructed persona that bore little resemblance to his authentic self? The Derek sitting beside me now seemed like a stranger, someone whose capacity for deception and betrayal I'd completely failed to recognize until it was too late to prevent the damage. Monday morning had arrived with crystalline clarity, the autumn air sharp and cold, the sky that particular shade of blue that made everything seem more vivid and real. I'd gotten up early, made breakfast for Ethan, helped him get ready for school, all while Derek went through his usual morning routine, completely unaware that this was the last morning we would share a home as husband and wife. He'd kissed my cheek before leaving, told me he'd be home around 6, reminded me we needed to discuss Thanksgiving plans with his mother soon. I'd nodded and smiled, watching him drive away in his luxury sedan, purchased with money that was partly mine, heading to an office where in approximately 2 hours he would be served with divorce papers. After dropping Ethan at school, I'd driven to Helen's office, where we'd done a final review of the divorce petition and temporary orders. The documents were comprehensive and damning. They outlined Derek's affair with supporting photographic evidence, detailed his dissipation of marital assets through the hidden credit card and transferred funds, documented his systematic deception over at least 8 months, and requested temporary full custody of Ethan with Derek having supervised visitation until a more complete custody evaluation could be conducted. Helen had also included a request for exclusive use of the family home, spousal support, child support, and attorney's fees. The financial disclosures I'd prepared showed our complete asset picture, including the business accounts Derek thought I didn't know about, the investments he'd moved, and the hidden credit card charges. Everything was documented, verified, and ready to be presented not just to Derek but eventually to a judge who would determine how our marital assets would be divided and what our post-divorce lives would look like. The process server had called at 10:15 to confirm that Derek had been successfully served. He'd been in his office meeting with a client when the server had arrived, and according to the report, Derek's face had gone white as he'd flipped through the documents, realizing immediately what was happening. The client had apparently asked if everything was okay, and Derek had stammered some excuse about unexpected legal paperwork, cutting the meeting short. Within minutes, my phone had started ringing, Derek calling over and over, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails demanding to know what was happening, insisting we needed to talk before I did anything rash. I'd ignored the calls, just as Helen had advised. There was nothing to discuss, no conversation that would change the reality of what Derek had done or what was now set in motion. He would have the opportunity to respond to the divorce petition through his attorney, to present his version of events in court, to fight for whatever custody and financial arrangements he believed he deserved. But the days of him controlling the narrative through deception and manipulation were over. By noon, the situation had escalated. Derek had apparently left work and driven to our house, where he'd found the locks changed, another action Helen had advised, executed that morning while Derek was being served. He'd called again, his voice now angry rather than pleading, threatening legal action for being locked out of his own home, demanding to know who I thought I was making unilateral decisions about our marriage. The irony of him objecting to unilateral decisions after months of conducting a secret affair and moving marital assets without my knowledge would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. Helen had fielded a call from Robert Fitzgerald, Derek's attorney, requesting an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. Helen had calmly explained that there was nothing to discuss beyond Derek's formal response to the divorce petition. If he wanted to negotiate property division or custody arrangements, we could schedule mediation once emotions had settled. But there would be no intimidation, no last-minute attempts to manipulate me into reconsidering, no opportunity for Derek to talk his way out of the consequences of his choices. I'd spent that afternoon in a strange state of numbness, handling business calls with clients while periodically checking my phone to see the accumulation of messages from Derek. His tone had cycled through disbelief, anger, pleading, and finally a kind of cold calculation that suggested he'd shifted into strategic mode. His last message had been brief and chilling: "You're going to regret this, Lauren, I promise you that." The threatening tone had been enough for Helen to immediately file for a temporary restraining order, adding it to the growing list of legal actions that would define the dissolution of our marriage. Nicole had come over that evening after I'd picked Ethan up from school. She'd brought dinner and moral support, staying with us through the difficult hours of early evening when Derek's absence was most noticeable. Ethan had been quiet and withdrawn, clearly struggling with the reality that his father wasn't coming home, that the separation we discussed was now actually happening. We'd eaten pizza and watched cartoons, and Nicole had helped with bedtime, reading stories, and providing the kind of steady adult presence that helped Ethan feel safe despite everything changing around him. After Ethan was asleep, Nicole and I had sat in my kitchen drinking tea, and I'd finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd set in motion. Filing for divorce wasn't just ending a marriage, it was acknowledging that 10 years of my life had been built on foundations that weren't as solid as I'd believed, that the future I'd envisioned would never happen, that I was now a single mother facing the challenges of co-parenting with someone who'd proven himself fundamentally untrustworthy. But beneath the grief and fear, there was also something else, a sense of my own power and agency that had been dormant for years. I'd discovered Derek's betrayal, investigated it thoroughly, prepared strategically, and acted decisively. I hadn't collapsed into victimhood or allowed him to control how this situation unfolded. I'd taken charge of my own life and my son's future, and while the path ahead was uncertain, it was a path I would walk on my own terms rather than as someone else's deceived and manipulated partner. The following days brought a cascade of revelations that transformed my understanding of Derek's betrayal from a personal tragedy into something far more complex and disturbing. Tuesday morning, I'd received a call from Greg Hoffman, Derek's business partner, requesting an urgent meeting. His voice had carried a tension that immediately put me on alert, and when he'd asked if we could meet somewhere private away from the office, I'd agreed to meet him at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. Greg had arrived looking haggard, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd spent a sleepless night wrestling with whatever he needed to tell me. We'd taken a corner table far from other customers, and after ordering coffee neither of us would drink, Greg had pulled out a folder thick with documents. What he told me over the next hour had reframed everything I thought I understood about Derek's affair and his financial manipulations. Greg had discovered that Derek had been embezzling from their business. Not enormous amounts that would trigger immediate red flags, but steady withdrawals disguised as legitimate business expenses, client reimbursements that never actually happened, consulting fees paid to shell companies that didn't exist. Over the course of 18 months, Derek had stolen nearly $200,000 from Hayes and Hoffman financial advisors, money that belonged equally to both partners and, by extension, to the clients who trusted them with their investments. The discovery had come about accidentally when one of their major clients had questioned a discrepancy in their quarterly report. Greg had begun digging deeper, and what he'd found had shaken him to his core. His business partner and college friend, the man he'd trusted implicitly for over a decade, had been systematically stealing from their joint enterprise. Greg had confronted Derek the previous day, shortly before I'd served him with divorce papers, and Derek had admitted everything, claiming he'd needed the money to cover unexpected expenses he couldn't explain to me. Those unexpected expenses, Greg and I both now understood, were the costs of maintaining a mistress and preparing for divorce. The hidden credit card charges, the hotel rooms, the jewelry, the transferred funds, all of this had apparently been supplemented by money stolen from the business Derek co-owned. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was criminal. Greg was now faced with the impossible choice of reporting his partner's embezzlement to authorities, potentially destroying the business they'd built together, or trying to handle it privately while protecting their clients and their professional reputations. I'd sat across from Greg, watching this man who'd been at our wedding, who'd played with Ethan at countless family gatherings, who'd considered Derek his closest friend, as he struggled with the realization that he'd never truly known his business partner at all. The pain in his eyes had mirrored what I'd been feeling, that particular anguish of discovering someone you trusted completely had been living a double life right in front of you, and you'd been too trusting or too blind to see the truth. Greg had asked for my advice, which I'd found grimly ironic given that I was still processing my own discovery of Derek's deceptions. But my professional background in financial analysis had given me a clear perspective on his situation. He needed to report the embezzlement to their business insurance carrier immediately, document everything thoroughly, and consult with both a criminal attorney and a business litigation specialist. His responsibility was to his clients first, and protecting them meant being transparent about what Derek had done, even if it meant destroying the business in the process. I'd also shared with Greg the information Marcus had uncovered about Derek's affair and his plans to file for divorce. Greg had been shocked by the depth of Derek's duplicity, though in retrospect, he'd admitted there had been signs he'd rationalized away: Derek's increasingly secretive behavior, his defensive reactions when questioned about certain expenses, his insistence on handling particular accounts personally without Greg's oversight. All of these red flags had been visible, but like me, Greg had trusted Derek enough to accept his explanations without pushing for deeper truth. We'd agreed to coordinate our legal responses. Helen would be informed of the embezzlement, which significantly strengthened my divorce case by demonstrating that Derek's financial deceptions went far beyond just hiding an affair. Greg would file a formal complaint with the State Financial Regulatory Board and notify their business insurance carrier. The criminal implications would be handled by authorities once the embezzlement was officially reported. Derek's carefully constructed double life was unraveling faster than he could possibly have anticipated. That afternoon, I'd received another unexpected call, this time from Diane Hayes, Derek's mother. I'd steeled myself for an angry defense of her son, accusations that I was overreacting or trying to destroy Derek's life out of spite. Instead, Diane's voice had been quiet and devastated when she'd asked if she could come over to talk. Against my better judgment but curious about what she might have to say, I'd agreed to meet her after Ethan's school day ended. Diane had arrived at my door looking older than her 63 years, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, her eyes red from crying. I'd made tea while she sat at my kitchen table, and then she'd told me something that changed my understanding of Derek's behavior in fundamental ways. This wasn't the first time Derek had engaged in systematic deception and betrayal. 20 years ago, he'd done something similar to his previous serious girlfriend, conducting an affair while they'd been planning their wedding, stealing money from the joint account they'd opened for wedding expenses, lying with such conviction that even his own mother had believed him when he'd claimed the girlfriend was unstable and making false accusations. Diane had only learned the truth years later when the ex-girlfriend had reached out to her, not out of vindictiveness but out of concern when she'd heard Derek was getting married again. The ex-girlfriend had shared documentation of Derek's previous betrayals, warned Diane that her son had a pattern of behavior that suggested deeper psychological issues, urged her to encourage Derek to seek therapy before he destroyed another relationship. Diane had confronted Derek about these allegations, but he'd been so convincing in his denials, so hurt by his mother's apparent lack of faith in him, that she'd chosen to believe her son over a woman she barely knew. Now, sitting in my kitchen, Diane was consumed with guilt. She'd known Derek had the capacity for this kind of betrayal, had seen evidence of it before, but she'd chosen willful ignorance over difficult truth. She'd watched me marry her son, had helped welcome Ethan into the world, had been part of our family for a decade, all while carrying the knowledge that Derek had done this before and would likely do it again. Her apology had been genuine and heartbreaking, but it had also been tinged with a kind of relief that the truth was finally out, that she no longer had to pretend she didn't know what her son was capable of, that someone else had finally held Derek accountable for his actions. Diane had offered to testify on my behalf in the divorce proceedings if needed, to share what she knew about Derek's history and patterns. She'd also promised to maintain a relationship with Ethan regardless of what happened between Derek and me, insisting that her grandson shouldn't lose his grandmother just because his father had failed as a husband. The conversation had been difficult and emotionally complex, but it had also provided a strange kind of validation. This wasn't about my inadequacy as a wife or partner. This was about Derek's fundamental character flaws, patterns of behavior that predated our relationship and would likely continue long after our divorce was finalized. Wednesday had brought Marcus's final surveillance report, and what it contained had been both shocking and, in a terrible way, almost predictable. After being served with divorce papers, Derek had gone directly to Vanessa, and their conversation had been captured in detail by Marcus's equipment. Derek had told Vanessa that I'd somehow discovered the affair and filed for divorce, positioning himself as the victim of my supposedly irrational jealousy and vindictiveness. He'd assured her that once the divorce was finalized, they could finally be together openly, that my legal actions had actually freed him to move forward with their relationship without guilt or complication. Vanessa's response had been telling. Rather than offering comfort or support, she'd begun questioning Derek about his financial situation, asking pointed questions about how much the divorce would cost him, whether he'd lose the business, what kind of assets he'd be able to retain. When Derek had admitted that the divorce petition included evidence of his affair and financial misconduct, that he might face both civil and criminal liability, Vanessa's entire demeanor had changed. She'd told Derek she needed time to think, that this situation was more complicated than she'd anticipated, that maybe they should take a break while he sorted out his legal problems. Derek had been devastated by Vanessa's withdrawal, pleading with her not to abandon him when he needed her most, reminding her of all the promises they'd made to each other. But Vanessa had been unmoved, explaining that she'd entered their relationship believing Derek was a successful businessman who would leave his wife and provide her with the lifestyle she deserved. A Derek facing potential criminal charges, business failure, and significant financial losses in divorce proceedings wasn't what she'd signed up for. She'd ended their affair there in the parking lot, walking away from Derek with the same cold calculation she'd brought to the relationship from the beginning. The surveillance footage of Derek's face as Vanessa had walked away had been almost painful to watch. He'd stood there alone in the country club parking lot, the place where he'd spent months conducting his secret affair, and he'd finally confronted the reality that he'd destroyed his marriage, his business partnership, his reputation, and his financial security for a relationship that had been built entirely on deception and mutual exploitation. There'd been no grand romance, no deep connection, no love worth the sacrifices he'd made. Just two people using each other, and now that the costs had become real, abandoning each other with the same lack of genuine feeling that had characterized their entire affair. I'd watched that footage in Helen's office, and while part of me had felt a grim satisfaction at seeing Derek face consequences, another part had just felt sad. This was the man I'd loved enough to marry, to build a life with, to create a child with. Whatever he'd become, whatever choices he'd made, there had been a time when I'd believed in his fundamental goodness and integrity. That belief had been misplaced, but the loss of it still hurt in ways I hadn't fully processed. Thursday had brought the first mediation session, despite my reservations about sitting in a room with Derek so soon after everything had exploded. Helen had advised that attempting mediation showed good faith, and if Derek proved unwilling to negotiate reasonably, his behavior would be documented and could work in our favor if the case went to trial. The session had been scheduled at a neutral mediator's office, with both attorneys present to guide the process. Derek had arrived looking disheveled and defeated, a stark contrast to his usual polished appearance. His attorney Robert Fitzgerald had clearly briefed him on the severity of his situation. The affair was documented, the embezzlement was being investigated, the financial misconduct was provable, and his attempts to hide assets had been thoroughly exposed. Derek was facing the divorce from a position of profound weakness, and his attorney knew that fighting aggressively would only make things worse. The mediation had been tense and uncomfortable. The mediator, a calm woman named Susan Chen who specialized in high-conflict divorces, had established ground rules about respectful communication and focused negotiation. Derek had wanted to speak to me directly, to explain himself, to somehow make me understand why he'd done what he'd done. But Helen had shut that down immediately, insisting that all communication go through the mediator and focus on the practical matters of dissolving our marriage rather than relitigating the betrayals that had led us to this point. We'd spent 4 hours working through the basic framework of a settlement. Derek would move out of the family home permanently, with Ethan remaining with me as primary custodial parent. Derek would have supervised visitation initially, with the possibility of unsupervised visits once he'd completed counseling and demonstrated stability. The house would be sold eventually, with proceeds split according to a formula that accounted for my greater financial contribution to the down payment and mortgage payments, as documented in the records I'd carefully maintained. Derek's share of Hayes and Hoffman Financial Advisors would be liquidated, with proceeds first going to repay the embezzled funds and then being split according to the divorce settlement. If criminal charges were filed, Derek's share might be subject to additional claims, but that would be handled separately from our divorce proceedings. My own business assets and retirement accounts, which I'd built before and during our marriage, would remain mine entirely, protected by the prenuptial agreement Derek had so confidently insisted upon years ago. The most contentious part of the mediation had been spousal support. Derek's attorney had argued that since I had my own income, I didn't need support from Derek. Helen had countered that I'd sacrificed career advancement to prioritize raising Ethan while Derek built his business, that my current income didn't reflect my full earning potential, and that Derek's misconduct warranted compensatory support. After extensive negotiation, we'd agreed on a monthly support amount that would continue for 5 years, giving me time to expand my business and rebuild financial independence. Child support had been calculated according to state guidelines based on our respective incomes and the custody arrangement. Derek had bristled at the amount, claiming he couldn't afford it along with the spousal support and his share of marital debt. Helen had coldly pointed out that Derek had found money for hotel rooms and jewelry when it suited his purposes, and he would need to find money to support his child. The mediator had backed Helen's position, noting that Derek's financial hardship was entirely self-created through his misconduct. By the end of the session, we had the outline of a settlement agreement that would need to be formalized by our attorneys and approved by the court. It wasn't everything I might have gotten if we'd gone to trial, but it was fair and it was final. More importantly, it meant Ethan wouldn't have to endure the trauma of his parents fighting publicly in court, testifying about their failed marriage, exposing him to media attention and community gossip beyond what was already inevitable. Derek had tried to speak to me as we'd been leaving the mediation, stepping into my path in the parking lot, his eyes desperate and pleading. He'd started to say something about still caring about me, about hoping we could eventually be civil for Ethan's sake, about regretting the choices that had brought us to this point. I'd looked at him, really looked at him, and I'd realized I felt nothing, not love, not hate, not even the anger that had sustained me through the past weeks. Just a kind of distant pity for a man who'd destroyed his own life through selfishness and deception. 6 months had passed since that parent-teacher conference changed everything, and standing in the empty living room of what used to be our family home, I felt the weight of transformation settle around me. The house had sold quickly, fetched a price above asking, and tomorrow the new owners would move in. Ethan and I had already settled into our new apartment across town, a smaller space that somehow felt more like home than this house ever had in those final years. The divorce had been finalized 8 weeks ago, the judge approving our mediated settlement without modification. Derek had attended the final hearing looking diminished, his business suit hanging looser on a frame that had lost weight from stress. The embezzlement charges had been resolved through a plea agreement that included restitution, probation, and community service but no jail time, largely because Greg had advocated for leniency to protect their remaining clients and the business reputation. Derek had been forced to sell his share of Hayes and Hoffman at a significant discount, and Greg was now rebuilding the firm with a new partner, someone whose integrity had been thoroughly vetted. Ethan had adjusted better than I'd feared, thanks in large part to continued counseling with Dr. Kim and the stability I'd worked hard to maintain. His relationship with Derek remained complicated. He saw his father every other weekend now, unsupervised visits that Derek had earned through months of therapy and demonstrated consistency. The visits were cordial but distant, with Ethan treating his father more like a friendly uncle than the central figure he'd once been. It saddened me sometimes, watching my son protect himself through emotional distance, but Dr. Kim assured me this was healthy boundary setting that would serve him well. Derek had moved to a small apartment near the edge of town, taken a job as a junior financial advisor at a large firm where his past mistakes limited his advancement opportunities. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he was dating someone new, a woman closer to his own age who apparently knew nothing about his history. I wondered sometimes if he'd learned anything from the destruction he'd caused, or if he was simply more careful now about hiding his true nature. Either way, it was no longer my concern. My own life had flourished in unexpected ways. The financial analysis business I'd been building quietly for years had expanded dramatically once I devoted full attention to it. Word had spread about my expertise, and I now had a waiting list of clients seeking my services. The income exceeded what Derek and I had earned together, providing Ethan and me with comfortable security and the freedom to make choices based on what we wanted rather than what we could afford. Claire Daniels had become a genuine friend, her courage in speaking up that afternoon having opened a door to truth I desperately needed but hadn't known how to find on my own. She'd attended the final hearing as my guest, a silent show of support that had meant more than I could express. Ethan continued to thrive in her classroom, his creativity and confidence returning as the tension that had marked those difficult months finally eased. Nicole had been right there through everything, just as she'd always been, helping me pack up this house, listening when I needed to talk, celebrating small victories and commiserating over setbacks. Rachel had provided legal guidance even after the divorce was finalized, helping me understand my rights and options as I navigated co-parenting with someone I no longer trusted. Diane had kept her promise about maintaining a relationship with Ethan, taking him for occasional grandmother-grandson outings that gave him connection to Derek's family without requiring me to be involved. Standing in that empty house, I thought about the woman who'd sat in that classroom 6 months ago, listening to Claire reveal truths that would shatter her world. That woman had been scared and uncertain, facing a future she'd never wanted or imagined. But she'd also been stronger than she knew, capable of investigation and strategic thinking, able to take control of a situation that could have destroyed her. I was proud of her, of how she'd handled the revelation and everything that followed. The lessons I'd learned went beyond the specifics of discovering an affair or navigating divorce. I'd learned that trust must be accompanied by verification, that love without honesty is just another form of exploitation, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and your child is to walk away from something broken rather than exhaust yourself trying to fix it. I'd learned that financial independence isn't just about money but about the freedom to make choices that honor your own integrity and well-being. Most importantly, I'd learned that endings, however painful, create space for new beginnings. Ethan and I were building a life defined not by who'd betrayed us but by what we valued and chose to create together. We were a team, mother and son, facing the world with resilience and hope. The future was uncertain, as futures always are, but it was ours to shape on our own terms. My phone buzzed with a text from the movers confirming tomorrow's pickup time for the last few items in storage. I took one final look around the empty rooms that had witnessed both happy memories and terrible betrayals, and then I walked out the front door, locked it behind me, and dropped the keys in the lockbox for the new owners. The chapter was closed. Whatever came next would be written on blank pages, and I was ready for the story that Ethan and I would write together, free from deception and full of possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.